Thank you. It is a privilege to address an audience that understands the gravity of what we are witnessing in the global economic order today. What I intend to do over the course of this address is something that I believe is long overdue in public economic discourse, and that is to move beyond the headlines, beyond the political theater, and beyond the simplified narratives that too often dominate our understanding of trade conflict. I want to speak plainly, analytically, and with the full weight of the data that my colleagues at the Treasury, at the International Monetary Fund, at the World Bank, and at central banks across the globe have been carefully assembling over many months. Because the truth of the matter is this: when two of the world's largest economies enter into sustained, escalating trade conflict, the consequences do not stay contained within their borders. They radiate outward through supply chains, through currency markets, through commodity prices, through capital flows, and through the confidence of investors, governments, and ordinary working families who are simply trying to plan their financial futures. Let me begin with the foundational principle that every serious economist understands, but that public conversation too often overlooks. The global economy is not a collection of isolated national systems that happen to trade occasionally. It is a deeply integrated, interdependent network of production, finance, and consumption that has been constructed over 8 decades of deliberate institutional architecture. From the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944 to the formation of the World Trade Organization to the countless bilateral and multilateral trade agreements that have gradually lowered barriers and expanded the flow of goods, services, capital, and technology across borders. That architecture was not built by accident. It was built because the nations that emerged from the devastation of the Second World War understood with terrible clarity that economic nationalism, trade fragmentation, and competitive retaliation had been among the contributing forces that destabilized democratic governments, impoverished working populations, and ultimately created the political conditions for catastrophic conflict. The institutions they built were imperfect. And I have never been one to argue that the gains from globalization were distributed equitably, or that every community and every worker shared in the prosperity that expanding trade generated. But those institutions created a framework of predictability, of rules-based engagement, and of dispute resolution that allowed the global economy to grow from approximately $8 trillion in output in 1960 to over $100 trillion today. What we are now experiencing is not merely a disagreement over tariff schedules or trade balances. What we are experiencing is a fundamental stress test of that entire architecture. And the outcome of that stress test will shape economic conditions not for quarters, but for decades. I want to be precise about that claim because I recognize that it sounds dramatic, and I do not use dramatic language lightly. But when we examine the transmission mechanisms through which trade conflict affects national economies, and when we trace those mechanisms through the specific structural vulnerabilities of individual countries and regions, what emerges is a picture of cascading consequences that no single nation, not the United States, not China, not Germany, not any economy large or small, can fully insulate itself from. Let us begin with the United States itself, because any honest accounting of what this conflict means for the global economy must start with an honest accounting of what it means for the country at the center of it. The United States enters this period of trade tension with a set of genuine structural strengths that should not be minimized. We have the world's largest and most liquid financial markets. We have the deepest pool of venture capital and innovation capital on Earth. We have a labor market that, despite its inequities and its geographic disparities, has demonstrated remarkable resilience through successive economic shocks. Our agricultural sector remains among the most productive in human history. Our energy sector, transformed by the shale revolution of the past 15 years, has made us not merely energy independent, but a significant net exporter of liquefied natural gas, crude oil, and refined petroleum products. These are not trivial advantages. They are the foundations upon which American economic leadership has rested, and they do not disappear because of a trade dispute. But strengths must be understood alongside vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities of the American economy in the current environment are real and consequential. The United States is a consumption-driven economy. Approximately 70% of our gross domestic product is generated by consumer spending. That means that when import prices rise because of tariffs, the cost is borne disproportionately by American households, particularly those in the middle and lower income brackets who spend a higher share of their income on goods. The notion that tariffs are primarily a cost imposed on foreign exporters is, I must say with some emphasis, economically incorrect. Tariffs are taxes. They are taxes on imports, and they are paid by American importers, and those costs are passed through, partially, not always fully, but substantially, to American consumers. When we impose a 25% tariff on steel from Canada, American manufacturers who use steel as an input, automotive producers, construction companies, appliance manufacturers, energy infrastructure developers, face higher production costs. When those higher costs get reflected in the prices of finished goods, American families pay more for their cars, their homes, their refrigerators, and their energy infrastructure. This is not a theoretical model. This is the documented empirical experience of the tariffs imposed in 2018 and 2019, which multiple independent economic analyses, including work conducted by economists at the Federal Reserve and at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, found to have raised prices for American consumers and reduced real incomes. Now I want to turn specifically to the Canada-United States dimension of this conflict, because it represents what I would describe as a particularly instructive and frankly troubling case study in the economics of trade disruption between deeply integrated partners. The United States and Canada are not merely trading partners in the conventional sense. We are, in many respects, a single integrated manufacturing ecosystem that happens to span an international border. Consider the automotive industry, which is perhaps the clearest example of how deeply intertwined our productive capacity has become. A modern automobile assembled in Michigan or Ohio or Tennessee may contain components, engine parts, transmission systems, electrical wiring harnesses, aluminum stampings that have crossed the Canada-United States border 4, 5, or 6 times during the production process. Each time a tariff is applied at that border, it adds cost to the final product. And unlike a tariff applied to a finished good imported from a distant country, a tariff applied within an integrated production network cannot easily be avoided by switching suppliers, because the integration itself, the specialization, the just-in-time logistics systems, the long-term contractual relationships, took decades to build and cannot be unwound in months or even years without enormous economic disruption and cost. The trade data makes this integration concrete. In 2023, total goods trade between the United States and Canada exceeded $770 billion. Canada was the largest export market for American goods, larger than China, larger than the European Union taken as a whole, larger than Mexico. 36 American states count Canada as their single largest export destination. The energy relationship alone represents an extraordinary degree of interdependence. Canada supplies approximately 60% of American crude oil imports, and the pipeline infrastructure that moves that energy was built, optimized, and operated on the assumption of a stable, tariff-free trading relationship. When that assumption is disrupted, the consequences are not abstract. They show up in refinery input costs, in regional gasoline prices, in the capital investment decisions of energy companies planning infrastructure for the next decade. What Canada's response to American trade pressure tells us is also deeply instructive for understanding how middle powers navigate economic coercion from larger partners. Canada has responded to American tariff pressure not with passive acceptance, but with a calibrated, multidimensional strategy that simultaneously imposes retaliatory costs on American exporters, diversifies Canadian trade relationships away from the United States, and accelerates domestic investment in sectors that reduce Canadian vulnerability to American market access. The retaliatory tariffs that Canada has imposed on American goods, targeting products from politically sensitive American states, including agricultural goods from farming communities in the Midwest and manufactured goods from industrial states, reflect a sophisticated understanding of American political economy. By making the costs of trade conflict visible and concentrated in communities with political influence, Canada has sought to create domestic American pressure for de escalation. This is not a new strategy. It is the same logic that informed European retaliation during previous episodes of American trade unilateralism, but it is being executed with notable discipline and strategic clarity. The broader point I want to establish in this opening section is that the Canada United States trade conflict is not an isolated bilateral dispute. It is one node in a larger network of trade tensions that is reshaping the architecture of global commerce. And as I will explain in the sections that follow, the consequences of that reshaping are being felt in different ways through different transmission mechanisms with different degrees of severity in every region of the world. From the export dependent economies of Southeast Asia to the commodity producing nations of sub Saharan Africa, from the manufacturing powerhouses of continental Europe to the emerging middle classes of Latin America, the disruption of the rules based trading system that the current period of trade conflict represents is generating economic uncertainty that is already measurable in slower growth forecasts, reduced investment, currency volatility, and rising costs for ordinary families. It is to those country by country consequences that I will now turn with the analytical rigor and the honest assessment of risk that the moment demands. Having established the foundational framework through which we must understand this conflict, its deep roots in the integrated architecture of global trade, its specific and measurable consequences for the United States and Canada, and its capacity to transmit economic disruption far beyond the borders of the two primary combatants, I want to turn now to the country by country analysis that I believe is essential for any serious understanding of what is at stake. I will move through the major economies and regions of the world with the same methodical attention to data and structural logic that I would bring to congressional testimony or to a formal address before the International Monetary Fund. Because the truth that the global economic community must confront is that there is no nation on earth, no economy, however large or small, however open or closed, however advanced or developing, that exists outside the web of consequences that a sustained trade conflict between the United States and its major trading partners generates. The channels of transmission are multiple, they are interconnected, and in many cases, they are mutually reinforcing in ways that amplify the initial shock well beyond what simple bilateral trade flow analysis would suggest. Let me begin with China, because no analysis of global trade conflict can proceed very far without grappling seriously and honestly with the role of the Chinese economy, both as a direct participant in trade tensions with the United States and as a structural force that shapes the economic calculations of every other nation on Earth. China enters this period of elevated trade tension with a set of characteristics that make its situation uniquely complex and, from the perspective of global economic stability, uniquely consequential. On one hand, China has demonstrated over the past 4 decades a capacity for economic adaptation and industrial upgrading that has been, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The transformation of the Chinese economy from a predominantly agrarian system to the world's largest manufacturer and second largest economy by nominal gross domestic product, a transformation accomplished within a single human lifetime, represents one of the most remarkable episodes of development in economic history. That capacity for adaptation means that China is not a passive victim of trade conflict. It has the institutional resources, the industrial base, the foreign exchange reserves, and the state coordination mechanisms to respond to external economic pressure with significant countermeasures. On the other hand, China's economy enters this period with a set of structural vulnerabilities that are now more visible than they have been at any point in the past 20 years. The property sector, which at its peak accounted for approximately 25 to 30% of Chinese economic activity when measured across its full upstream and downstream linkages, has undergone a prolonged and painful deleveraging following the difficulties of major developers, including Evergrande and Country Garden. Consumer confidence in China has been measurably depressed by this property sector correction, by the lingering economic effects of extended pandemic era restrictions, and by a youth unemployment rate that reached historically high levels in 2023 before the government suspended publication of the data series, a decision that itself signals the political sensitivity of the underlying economic conditions. Deflationary pressures have emerged in the Chinese economy that stand in stark contrast to the inflationary pressures that have dominated economic policy discussions in the United States and Europe. And deflation in an economy carrying significant debt loads creates its own set of deeply problematic dynamics as the real burden of debt rises even as nominal incomes stagnate. Into this already complex domestic economic environment, the escalation of trade conflict with the United States introduces additional and significant headwinds. American tariffs on Chinese goods, which have escalated dramatically from the initial rounds of the 2018 trade war through subsequent additions and now through the most recent escalation, affect Chinese export industries that employ tens of millions of workers, particularly in the coastal manufacturing provinces of Guangdong, Zhejiang, Fujian, and Jiangsu. The direct employment effects of reduced export demand are compounded by multiplier effects through domestic supply chains, through reduced consumer spending by affected workers, and through reduced investment by manufacturers facing uncertain access to the American market. The Chinese government has responded to these pressures through a combination of monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and an intensified push to redirect Chinese exports toward alternative markets, including markets in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa, and to accelerate the development of domestic consumption as a driver of growth. These are rational policy responses, but their effectiveness is limited by the structural factors I have described, and the redirection of Chinese export capacity toward alternative markets creates its own set of consequences for the economies receiving that redirected trade, as I will discuss. What the Chinese situation illustrates with particular clarity is a dynamic that I would describe as the strategic decoupling dilemma. Both the United States and China have expressed, with varying degrees of explicitness, a desire to reduce their economic dependence on each other, to build more resilient, more domestically grounded supply chains, to reduce the vulnerability that comes from deep interdependence with a strategic competitor. And there are legitimate national security arguments for some degree of supply chain diversification, particularly in sectors involving critical technologies, advanced semiconductors, rare earth minerals, and defense-related manufacturing. I have myself argued in testimony before Congress and in public statements that the United States must make strategic investments in domestic semiconductor capacity, in critical mineral processing, and in other sectors where excessive concentration of supply in a single foreign country represents a genuine vulnerability. But the critical analytical distinction that I want to draw here is between targeted, strategically justified supply chain diversification on one hand and broad-based economic decoupling on the other. The former is a prudent response to legitimate security concerns. The latter is an economically costly exercise that reduces the efficiency gains from international specialization, raises prices for consumers and producers in both countries, and this point deserves particular emphasis, does not actually eliminate the interdependence that generates the vulnerability, because global supply chains are too complex, too deeply integrated, and too economically efficient to be rapidly or completely unwound. What broad decoupling achieves in practice is not security but disruption. Disruption that imposes costs on both parties while creating opportunities for third country actors who are not constrained by the bilateral conflict. Turning now to the European Union, we encounter a set of economic conditions and policy challenges that are, in some respects, distinct from those facing either the United States or China, but that are connected to the broader trade conflict through multiple and mutually reinforcing channels. The European Union is the world's largest trading bloc by the value of goods and services trade, and it is an economy that is structurally more dependent on exports as a share of gross domestic product than the United States. Germany, which remains the industrial engine of the European economy despite the significant challenges it has faced in recent years, derives approximately 47% of its gross domestic product from exports, a ratio that makes it extraordinarily sensitive to any disruption in global trade flows, any increase in trade barriers, or any reduction in the confidence of global investors and corporate planners. The German automotive industry, which has for decades been one of the crown jewels of European industrial capacity, faces a confluence of challenges that would be daunting under any circumstances. The transition to electric vehicle technology, which requires massive capital investment, and the restructuring of supply chains built around internal combustion engine components. Intensifying competition from Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers who have achieved cost advantages through scale, state support, and rapid technological development. And now the additional uncertainty generated by American trade policy, which has imposed tariffs on European steel and aluminum and has raised the prospect of additional tariffs on European automobiles. The European Union's response to American trade pressure has been characteristically measured but firm, reflecting the institutional culture of an economic bloc that has consistently sought to operate within the rules-based framework of the World Trade Organization, while maintaining the credibility of its own retaliatory capacity as a deterrent against unilateral American action. The European Commission has prepared lists of retaliatory tariffs targeting American goods, has engaged in intensive diplomatic consultations aimed at negotiated resolution, and has simultaneously accelerated its own strategic autonomy agenda. The effort to reduce European dependence on external suppliers in critical sectors, including semiconductors, energy, defense, and advanced materials. The energy dimension of European strategic autonomy deserves particular attention because the disruption of Russian natural gas supplies following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 forced a rapid and costly restructuring of European energy supply that has permanently altered the continent's energy economics. Europe now imports significantly larger volumes of liquefied natural gas from the United States and from Qatar, and this energy relationship creates both a commercial interdependence with the United States and a potential point of leverage in trade negotiations that did not exist at the same scale 5 years ago. The smaller European economies, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Sweden, the Czech Republic, Poland, face the consequences of trade conflict through their deep integration into German-led European supply chains and through their own significant export exposures to both American and Asian markets. Poland, which has emerged as a major manufacturing hub for automotive components, electronics, and consumer goods serving Western European markets, faces particular complexity. It has benefited enormously from European Union membership and from the eastward expansion of German industrial supply chains, but it is also exposed to any slowdown in German industrial activity triggered by trade-related demand weakness. The Baltic states, deeply integrated into both European and Nordic economic networks, face additional complexity from their geographic proximity to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the associated disruptions to regional trade and investment patterns. I want to spend some time now on Japan and South Korea because these two economies represent a particularly instructive case study in how advanced, export-dependent allies of the United States navigate trade conflict involving their primary security partner. Japan and South Korea are both formal treaty allies of the United States. Both host significant American military presences, and both depend on American security guarantees for their fundamental national defense in a region where the security environment has become increasingly challenging. At the same time, both Japan and South Korea are deeply economically integrated with China. Japan conducts roughly 22% of its total trade with China, and South Korea conducts approximately 25%. And both face the deeply uncomfortable reality that the economic decoupling agenda that some voices in American policy circles advocate would impose severe costs on their own economies while simultaneously straining the alliance relationships that underpin their security.